I'm going to tell you a story that I've never told anyone before. Not the police, not my family, not even my therapist. Because honestly, I'm not sure anyone would believe me. Hell, I'm not sure I believe it myself, and I lived through it. My name is Jake Morrison, and 3 months ago I was part of a search and rescue team in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State. We were looking for a missing hiker, a 23-year-old college student named Sarah Chen, who had gone off trail during what was supposed to be a simple day hike. What we found instead changed everything I thought I knew about what lives in those mountains. And what we didn't find, that's what keeps me awake at night. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. Sarah had been missing for 48 hours. Her car was found at the Cascade River Road trailhead, but there was no sign of her on any of the marked trails. The weather was turning. A late October storm was rolling in, and we had maybe 12 hours before the mountains became completely impassable. I'd been doing search and rescue for 8 years. I'd found lost hikers, injured climbers, even recovered bodies from avalanches. But this case felt different from the moment we started hiking. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no insects, even the wind seemed muted. Our team split into 3 groups. I was with my partner, Mike Rodriguez, and we took the northern sector, the most remote area where someone could easily get lost if they wandered off the main trail. We'd been hiking for about 2 hours when we found the first sign of Sarah. It was her backpack, torn open, contents scattered across maybe 50 yards of forest floor. But here's the thing that made my blood run cold. The backpack wasn't just torn, it was shredded. Like something with claws had gone through it systematically, searching for something. "Base, this is Team 2, I radioed in. "We've got evidence of the missing hiker, but there's something wrong here. The damage pattern doesn't match any animal I know." That's when we heard the screaming. Not human screaming, something else. Something that made every hair on my body stand up. It was coming from deeper in the forest, maybe half a mile ahead. Mike and I looked at each other, and I could see the same fear in his eyes that I was feeling. We followed the sound, moving as quietly as we could. The screaming stopped, but now we could hear something else. A low, rhythmic sound that almost sounded like chanting, but not in any language I recognized. That's when we found Sarah Chen. She was alive, but barely, sitting against a massive Douglas fir, her eyes wide with terror, her left arm wrapped in what looked like torn pieces of her shirt. Blood was seeping through the makeshift bandage. "Sarah," I called out softly. "We're search and rescue, you're safe now." She looked at us like she didn't understand what we were saying. Then she spoke, and her voice was barely a whisper. "It bit me. It bit me. And then it just disappeared. You have to get me out of here before it comes back. I've been in the mountains my whole life. I know every predator, every dangerous animal that lives in these forests. But when I unwrapped Sarah's arm to assess her injuries, I saw bite marks unlike anything I'd ever encountered. They were too big for a cougar, too deep for a bear, and the pattern was all wrong. As we prepared to evacuate Sarah, she grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "You don't understand," she whispered. "It's still watching us. It's been watching us this whole time." That's when I looked up and saw the trees around us swaying, even though there was no wind. And in that moment, I realized Sarah was right. Something was watching us, something that had been hunting her for 2 days. And now it knew we were there. Let me back up and give you some context about where this happened, because the location is crucial to understanding what we encountered. The Cascade Mountains in Washington State are some of the most remote wilderness in the continental United States. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of acres of old-growth forest, deep valleys and peaks that haven't been fully explored. I've been part of the Olympic Peninsula Search and Rescue Team since 2016. We cover an area that includes some of the most challenging terrain in the Pacific Northwest. Most of our calls are routine: day hikers who got turned around, climbers who bit off more than they could chew, the occasional hunter who didn't make it back to camp. But the Cascade River Road area where Sarah went missing, that's different. The locals have stories about that region going back generations. Native American tribes considered certain parts of those mountains to be forbidden territory. Even today, experienced hikers avoid some of the deeper valleys, especially during certain times of the year. Sarah Chen was a biology student at the University of Washington. According to her roommate, she was an experienced hiker who knew the area well. She'd been studying local wildlife patterns for her thesis, which is why she was hiking alone with research equipment. Her plan was simple: a day hike to collect soil samples from a specific elevation zone. The weather report that Tuesday morning was clear, but mountain weather can change in minutes. By the time we got the call that Sarah was overdue, a storm front was already moving in from the Pacific. We had a narrow window to find her before the search would have to be suspended. Our team consisted of 6 people: myself, Mike Rodriguez, Sarah Kim, our medic, Tom Bradley, tracking specialist, Lisa Chen, no relation to the missing hiker, and our team leader, Captain David Walsh. We'd worked together for years, and we knew each other's strengths and limitations. But as we geared up at the trailhead that morning, something felt off. Captain Walsh kept checking his GPS coordinates, like he wasn't sure we were in the right place. Tom, who could track a mouse through a snowstorm, seemed unusually quiet. Even the weather felt wrong. Too warm for late October, with an oppressive humidity that made the air feel thick. We split into 3 teams and spread out across the search area. The plan was to work in a grid pattern, staying in radio contact every 30 minutes. Sarah's car had been found at the main trailhead, but her intended route took her into some of the most remote backcountry in the region. Mike and I took the northern sector because I knew the terrain better than anyone else on the team. I'd been hiking these trails since I was a kid, and my grandfather had been a logger in this area back in the 1960s. He used to tell me stories about things he'd seen in the deep woods, stories I'd always assumed were just old man tales meant to keep kids from wandering off. The first thing we noticed was the silence. In a healthy forest, you should hear birds, insects, small animals moving through the underbrush. But as we hiked deeper into Sarah's planned route, the forest became unnaturally quiet. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, like the trees themselves were absorbing sound. "You notice how quiet it is?" Mike asked after we'd been hiking for about an hour. I nodded, but I didn't want to voice what I was thinking. In my experience, when a forest goes completely silent, it's usually because there's a predator nearby, something big enough that every other living thing has decided to hide. We checked in with the other teams every 30 minutes, but nobody was finding anything. No footprints, no dropped gear, no signs that Sarah had ever been in the area. It was like she'd simply vanished. That's when we found her backpack, and that's when everything changed. The backpack was destroyed in a way that defied explanation. I've seen what bears do to camping gear. They're powerful, but they're also relatively clumsy. They'll tear through a tent or rip open a food container, but there's a randomness to the damage. This was different. Sarah's backpack had been systematically shredded, like something with incredible precision had gone through every pocket, every compartment, looking for something specific. The tears were clean, almost surgical, but made by something with claws. "Jesus Christ," Mike whispered, kneeling down to examine the scattered contents. What the hell could do this? Sarah's research equipment was scattered across maybe 50 yards of forest floor. Her GPS unit was crushed, the screen spiderwebbed like something had stepped on it with enormous force. Her water bottles were punctured with what looked like bite marks, but the holes were too big and too deep for any animal I knew. I tried to radio the other teams, but we were getting nothing but static. The storm front was moving in faster than predicted, and the dense canopy was interfering with our communications. We were effectively cut off from the rest of the search team. That's when Mike found the blood trail. Not drops or splashes like you'd expect from an injured hiker. This was a deliberate pattern, almost like something had been marking territory. The blood was fresh, maybe hours old, and it led deeper into the forest. We followed the trail for about half a mile, moving as quietly as we could. The forest around us seemed to be getting darker, even though it was still mid-afternoon. The trees were older here, massive Douglas firs and western red cedars that blocked out most of the sunlight. "Jake," Mike said, grabbing my arm. "Look at the trees." I looked up and saw something that made my blood run cold. The bark on several of the larger trees had been stripped away in long, parallel gouges. The marks were at least 8 feet off the ground, far too high for any known predator, and they were fresh. Sap was still bleeding from the wounds. That's when we heard the screaming, not human screaming, but something else entirely. It started low, almost like a moan, then built to a shriek that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The sound bounced off the trees, creating an echo that made it impossible to determine the direction. Mike and I froze, our hands instinctively moving to the bear spray on our belts. But this didn't sound like any bear I'd ever heard. It was too intelligent, too controlled, like something was trying to communicate, but in a language we couldn't understand. The screaming stopped as suddenly as it had started, replaced by a sound that was somehow worse, a low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to come from the forest itself. The words, if they were words, weren't in English or any language I recognized. "We need to get out of here," Mike whispered. "This isn't right. This isn't natural." But as we turned to leave, we heard something else, a weak voice calling for help. Human this time, definitely human. It was coming from the direction of the chanting, maybe a quarter-mile ahead. "That's got to be Sarah," I said, even though every instinct I had was screaming at me to run in the opposite direction. We checked our gear, made sure our radios were set to emergency frequency, and started moving toward the voice. The chanting got louder as we approached, and I could feel the temperature dropping. My breath was becoming visible, even though it had been warm just minutes before. That's when we saw her. Sarah Chen sitting against a massive tree, her left arm wrapped in bloody cloth, her eyes wide with a terror I'd never seen in another human being. But she wasn't alone. As we approached, I could see shapes moving in the trees around her. Not animals, something else. Something that seemed to shift and change every time I tried to focus on it. And that's when I realized the chanting wasn't coming from the forest. It was coming from whatever was circling Sarah, keeping her trapped against that tree. Sarah looked at us like she wasn't sure we were real. Her face was pale, almost gray, and she was shivering despite the warm air. But it was her eyes that really got to me. They had the look of someone who had seen something that fundamentally changed their understanding of the world. "You have to get me out of here," she whispered as we approached. "It's been keeping me here. It won't let me leave." I knelt down beside her to examine her injuries, and that's when I got my first clear look at the bite marks on her arm. I've seen animal attacks before, bear maulings, cougar bites, even dog attacks. This was different. The puncture wounds were too deep, too precise, and the pattern was unlike anything in my experience. "Sarah, what bit you?" I asked as gently as I could while unwrapping the makeshift bandage. She looked at me with those terrified eyes and said something that made my blood freeze. "I don't know. It looked like it was wearing someone else's skin." Mike was scanning the trees around us, his hand on his bear spray. "Jake," he said quietly, "we're being watched. There's something up there." I looked up and saw them, shapes moving through the canopy, too large to be any known animal, too fluid to be human. They seemed to flow from tree to tree without making a sound, always staying just at the edge of my vision. "How long have you been here?" I asked Sarah while trying to assess her injuries. 2 days, she whispered. I was collecting samples near the old logging road when I heard something following me. I thought it was just an animal at first, but then I saw it. It was mimicking me, copying my movements, my voice. The bite marks on Sarah's arm were infected, but not in a normal way. The flesh around the wounds had turned a dark purple color, and there were black veins spreading up toward her shoulder. I'd never seen anything like it. "Sarah, I need you to tell me exactly what happened. What bit you?" She looked at me with those haunted eyes and began to speak in a voice that was barely above a whisper. I was taking soil samples when I heard my own voice calling for help, but I was alone. I followed the sound, and that's when I saw it. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, but it moved wrong, like it was wearing a costume that didn't quite fit. And its face kept changing. Sometimes it looked human, sometimes it looked like animals I recognized, but mostly it just looked hungry. As Sarah spoke, the shapes in the trees were getting closer. I could see them more clearly now, bipedal, but with proportions that were all wrong. Their limbs were too long, their movements too fluid, and they seemed to be communicating with each other through that low chanting sound. "We need to move," Mike said, his voice tight with fear. "Whatever these things are, there are more of them now." I helped Sarah to her feet, but she was weaker than I'd expected. The infection from the bite was spreading fast, and she was running a fever. We needed to get her to medical attention immediately. That's when one of the creatures dropped from the trees directly in front of us. I got my first clear look at what had been hunting Sarah for 2 days, and I understood why she'd been so terrified. It was humanoid, but wrong in every possible way. Its skin looked like it had been stretched over a frame that was too big, and it kept shifting and changing, like it couldn't decide what it wanted to look like. Its eyes were completely black, and when it opened its mouth I could see rows of teeth that belonged to no earthly creature. But the worst part was when it spoke. It used Sarah's voice, perfectly mimicked, saying, "Help me. Please help me. I'm lost." That's when I realized what we were dealing with. These weren't just predators. They were something far more intelligent and far more dangerous. They were hunters that could mimic human voices, human appearance, maybe even human behavior. I tried to radio for backup, but all I got was static. We were on our own, trapped in the forest with creatures that shouldn't exist, and Sarah was getting sicker by the minute. And that's when I heard my own voice calling from the trees. "Mike, over here." I found something. Hearing my own voice calling from the trees was the most terrifying moment of my life. Mike looked at me, then at the direction of the voice, his face pale with realization. These things weren't just mimicking Sarah, they were learning from all of us. "That's not me," I whispered to Mike, but even as I said it, I could hear the doubt in his voice when he replied, "How do I know you're really you?" The creature in front of us tilted its head at an impossible angle, studying our interaction. Then it spoke again, this time in Mike's voice. "Jake, we need to get out of here. Something's wrong with Sarah." Sarah grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "Don't listen to them," she whispered. "They've been doing this for days. They learn your voice, your mannerisms, everything. That's how they hunt." More creatures were dropping from the trees around us. I counted at least 6, maybe more, all of them shifting and changing, all of them speaking in voices we recognized. I heard my grandfather's voice, my mother's voice, even my own voice from different times in my life. "The bite," Sarah said, her voice getting weaker. "It's not just an infection, it's changing me. I can hear them in my head now. They're trying to make me like them." I pulled out my bear spray, but I knew it would be useless against creatures like these. Mike had his emergency flare gun, but we only had 2 flares. We were outnumbered and outmatched. That's when the creatures made their move. They didn't attack directly. Instead, they began to circle us, moving in perfect coordination. The chanting got louder, more insistent, and I could feel it affecting my mind. My thoughts were becoming fuzzy, confused. "The sound," Sarah gasped. "Don't listen to the sound. It's how they control you." Mike fired a flare directly at the nearest creature. The bright red light illuminated the forest, and for a moment I could see them clearly. There were dozens of them, moving through the trees like a coordinated hunting pack. The creature hit by the flare let out a shriek that shook the entire forest. But instead of being injured, it seemed to absorb the light, growing larger and more defined. The flare had made it stronger. "Run," Sarah whispered. "Leave me here. They want me, not you." But I wasn't leaving anyone behind. I'd been doing search and rescue for 8 years, and I'd never lost someone on my watch. I wasn't about to start now. I grabbed Sarah under one arm, Mike took the other, and we started running. The creatures followed, moving through the trees above us, their chanting growing louder and more frenzied. We ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The forest seemed to be changing around us, paths appearing and disappearing, landmarks shifting. The creatures were herding us, driving us towards something. Then we heard it, running water, a stream, maybe a river. Water meant civilization, meant a way out. We pushed through the underbrush and found ourselves at the edge of a fast-moving creek. But the creatures had stopped following us. They stood at the tree line watching, but they wouldn't come near the water. Sarah looked at me with those infected eyes and said something that chilled me to the bone. "They can't cross running water. But Jake, I don't think I can either. The bite, it's changing me. I can feel myself becoming like them." I looked at Sarah's arm and the infection had spread to her shoulder. The black veins were pulsing, and her eyes were starting to change color. She was running out of time. "You have to leave me here," she said, "before I become one of them. before I hurt someone else. That's when our radio crackled to life. Captain Walsh's voice came through clearly for the first time in hours. All teams, we have a helicopter inbound. Emergency extraction at the river crossing. We could hear the helicopter approaching, but Sarah was getting worse. The infection was spreading faster now, and she was starting to make the same chanting sounds as the creatures. "Go," she whispered. "Tell them I didn't make it. Tell them the bite was too severe." But as the helicopter landed and we prepared to evacuate, I realized something that still haunts me today. The creatures weren't just hunting Sarah. They were studying us, learning from us. And now they had everything they needed to hunt others. We evacuated Sarah to Harborview Medical Center in Seattle. The official report stated that she had been attacked by an unknown animal, suffered severe lacerations and infection, and was found in a state of delirium after being lost for 48 hours. But that's not the whole truth. The doctors couldn't identify the infection in her bloodstream. They'd never seen anything like it. The bite marks didn't match any known predator, and the toxin in her system was unlike anything in their databases. Sarah spent 3 weeks in the hospital. During that time, she claimed to have no memory of what happened in the forest. She said she remembered hiking, then waking up in the hospital. The doctors attributed her previous statements to delirium and trauma, but I knew better. I'd seen the look in her eyes when we found her. I'd heard the things she said, and I'd seen what was hunting her in those woods. The official search and rescue report was filed and forgotten. Mike and I were commended for our successful rescue operation. Captain Walsh recommended us both for medals, but none of us ever talked about what we really saw out there. 3 weeks after the rescue, I got a call from the hospital. Sarah had been discharged, but she'd left something for me, a letter. When I opened it, there was only one line. "They're still out there, and now they know how to find us." That was 2 months ago. Since then, there have been 7 more disappearances in the Cascade Mountains, all experienced hikers, all in the same general area where we found Sarah. The search teams find evidence of the missing persons, torn clothing, scattered gear, blood trails that lead nowhere, but they never find the hikers. And the search teams report the same things Mike and I experienced: unnatural silence in the forest, the feeling of being watched, and voices calling from the trees that sound exactly like the missing persons. I've tried to warn people. I've submitted reports to the Forest Service, contacted wildlife biologists, even reached out to cryptozoologists. But without proof, without evidence, I'm just another search and rescue volunteer with a wild story. Last week I received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph taken by a trail camera in the Cascade Mountains. The timestamp showed it was taken 3 days ago. The image showed a figure standing at the edge of a clearing, tall, humanoid, but wrong in every way. But that's not what made my blood run cold. Written on the back of the photograph in handwriting I recognized were the words, "Thank you for helping me find my way back. Sarah." I drove to Sarah's apartment that same day. The landlord told me she'd moved out weeks ago, left no forwarding address, but her neighbors said they'd seen her recently, walking in the woods behind the building, always at dusk, always alone. I'm telling you this story because I need you to understand something. There are things in our forests that we don't understand, things that have learned to hunt us using our own voices, our own faces, our own trust against us. The search and rescue teams are still going out. They're still looking for the missing hikers, but I'm not part of those teams anymore, because I know what they're going to find out there, and I know what's going to find them. If you're a hiker, if you spend time in remote wilderness areas, if you've ever heard your own voice calling from the trees when you know you're alone, be careful. Trust your instincts. And if you ever encounter something that looks human but feels wrong, don't try to help it, because it might not be human at all. It might be something that learned to be human by studying people like Sarah Chen, people who went into the woods and never really came back. 3 nights ago, I woke up to the sound of someone calling my name from the forest behind my house. The voice was perfect. It sounded exactly like me, but I was inside, in my bed, and I live alone. I looked out the window and saw a figure standing at the tree line. It waved at me with my own gestures, smiled with my own smile, and then it disappeared into the darkness. If you made it this far, if you listened to my entire story, then you understand why some missing persons cases are never solved. But I need to know, have you ever heard your own voice calling from somewhere you've never been? Have you ever seen something in the woods that looked human but felt wrong? Comment the word mimic if you believe there are things in our forest that we don't understand, and let me know if you've ever encountered something that knew too much about you.